Paulette Jaster was born in 1954 and lived with her family on a ranch in Davison, Michigan. Paulette was known as a bright, pretty girl who was well-liked. In late August, Paulette left her Davison home to begin studies at Central Michigan University, but she dropped out after the initial semester. Within the next few years, Paulette started suffering from mental health issues. Paulette had recently gone through a breakup with her high school sweetheart and had quit her well-paying job at the Chevrolet plant in Flint, Michigan. By 1974, Paulette was also suspected of using marijuana. In June of 1977, Paulette told the Davison police that people were trying to kill her and, quote, use her mind when the police petitioned the state, saying Paulette was unable to care for herself. A county probate court deemed her mentally ill and sent her to a state hospital for evaluation and treatment. Paulette's sister believes Paulette may have been suffering from schizophrenia. At the time today, such a diagnosis might mean medication and treatment. But during the 1970s, mental illnesses were often judged as a character flaw, not as a physical malady or treatable body chemical imbalance. Less than 2 months after Paulette, then 23, entered the state hospital, she signed herself out for the next year. Paulette came and went from the family home in December of 1978, just before Christmas, and after a fight with her father, Paulette left Michigan for Florida, where the family had relatives. Paulette would return home in April of 1978. For her mother's birthday, she would leave the family house 2 days after the birthday and would never be seen again. She was last seen carrying an Army-style duffel bag and walking towards Interstate 69, not far from Davison. When her family did not hear from her for a while, they reported her missing. Police wouldn't find anything until almost a year later, when Social Security records showed that in 1980, Paulette earned $319 while working at a Walgreens lunch counter in Mesa, Arizona. There would be no leads after this, and the case grew cold for 3 years until in 1983, Carolyn Jaster received a tip that Paulette had returned to Florida and could be in trouble. Several witnesses would claim to have seen her in the last few months, but none of the sightings were ever confirmed. 6 more years would go by, and then in 1989, Paulette's sister received an anonymous call. The caller wouldn't say anything and hung up the phone. Every time she picked up, Paulette's sister believes it was Paulette. 7 more years passed, and in 1996, Michigan State Police issued a new nationwide missing person bulletin. For any information regarding Paulette, the police would receive a call that claimed that a Blue Earth, Minnesota Jane Doe could be Paulette. However, after forensic testing, she was ruled out. The case would once again grow cold. But her family never gave up searching for her. In 2014, Paulette siblings began searching missing persons websites, including one called Web Sleuths, which is a forum where registered users can discuss and classify information related to crimes, trials, and unsolved cases which they then try to solve. The site led them to a woman named Debbie Saunders, who goes by the name of Houston Mom on Web Sleuths. Debbie was able to find a victim of a hit-and-run case from 1980 that had some similarities to Paulette. She submitted her findings to forensic scientist Dr. Sharon M. Derrick, who noticed the similarities as well. But without fingerprints or DNA, Dr. Derrick had to use unorthodox methods to identify the body. A comparison of Jaster's dental charts with the dental work of the hit-and-run victim was a match, but not an exact match because of the lack of X-rays. Then scanning an autopsy photo, Derrick saw distinctive freckles on the woman's cheek. On January 30th, 2014, after comparing the 2 freckles on the woman's left cheek and one near the right eye to Paulette's, she was able to positively identify the victim of the fatal hit-and-run case as Paulette. It was found that Paulette hit Hitcher ride from Arizona to Houston and was seen getting out of an 18-wheeler at a truck stop on Interstate 10 shortly before midnight on March 28, 1980. Paulette had no identification on her when a car driven by an intoxicated driver swerved into her, killing her. However, the woman had a blue duffel bag that remained in the trucker's cab and stayed in his possession. The duffel bag detail was never followed up on, and the police never collected the bag from the trucker. According to a report from the Harris County Sheriff's Office, the young woman had been hit by Robert S. Cowick, who was 23 at the time. Cowick was arrested and charged with failure to stop and render aid, along with involuntary manslaughter. He pleaded guilty to failing to stop and was placed on probation for 5 years. In July of 1980, Paulette had been buried in Houston and was known only as Jane Doe from 1980 to 2014. After the positive identification, her grave, which was previously marked with only a case number, was finally replaced with the plaque identifying her as Paulette Jaster, with birth and death dates. William Earl Moldt. William Earl Moldt was a 40-year-old mortgage broker from Florida. On November 7, 1997, he went to a club in Lantana, Florida. William was not a heavy drinker. In fact, he rarely drank alcohol. He mostly kept to himself at the club, and then left alone in his 1994 Saturn SL. Around 11 p.m., according to witnesses, he did not appear to be drunk before he left the club. William called his girlfriend around 9:30 p.m. to say he would arrive home soon, but William did not make it home that night, or any of the nights after. When he did not arrive home, he was reported missing. Police searched for him, but were unable to find any clues or any leads as to where he might be. With no leads to investigate, his case grew cold. He remained missing for the next 2 decades. Then on August 28, 2019, a former resident was looking at his old neighborhood on Google Earth in Grand Isle, Sausalito housing development in Wellington, Florida, when he noticed what he thought was a car in a retention pond. The former owner told the current resident, Barry Fay, that the car was there in a retention pond behind his house and sent screenshots to him. When Fay got home, he looked into the pond behind his house but didn't notice anything, just as he had not noticed for the past 14 months that he had lived there. Feig called the neighbor, who owned a drone with the camera attached, and the footage it returned showed there was a car submerged in the pond. Feig called the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office immediately. When the vehicle was pulled from the water, it was heavily calcified, and skeletal remains were found inside of it. Investigators towed the car and the remains to the county medical examiner's office for processing, and 1 week later, the remains were positively identified as belonging to William Earl Moldt. Apparently, the vehicle had plainly been visible on Google Earth since 2007, but no one had noticed it until 2019. The police believe that William, while returning from the club, most definitely lost control of his vehicle and drove into the pond. At the time of his disappearance, the housing complex surrounding the pond was under construction and the car went undiscovered. Throughout the rest of the construction process, his family finally found closure after 22 years. The Strongsville Jane Doe. Linda Marie Piano lived with her stepfather, Brian Claflin. Her parents have been divorced, and her 2 siblings, Cheryl and Mike Piano, lived with their mother and her new boyfriend. According to Linda's mother and her siblings, Brian was abusive towards them, and so they decided to move away from him. But Linda decided to stay, as she was not fond of her mother's new boyfriend. According to Cheryl and Mike, Brian was abusive towards them, but wasn't abusive towards Linda, and both got along well on August 31st. Linda took her Mustang with her boyfriend to Cleveland to attend a World Series of Rock concert. At the old stadium, she would not arrive home that night. When she came home the early morning, Brian and Linda got into a fight, and he kicked her out of the house. Linda was never seen again. The next day, Brian called Linda's mother at their home in a Springfield mobile park and told her that he was looking for Linda. After calling their friends and family to no avail, they notified police. Police treated the cases of Linda had run away from home. Her family, however, kept searching. On February 5, 1975, 3 boys found skeletal remains along the bank of the Rocky River in Strongsville, which currently is known as Mill of Stream Run Reservation. There was no physical evidence at the scene. An autopsy later revealed the remains were that of a white female in her late teens or early 20s. The unknown woman died from a gunshot wound to the head. The case was classified as a homicide. Mike Piano heard a TV news report about the woman found in Strongsville and wondered if it was his sister. He immediately called police in the Cleveland suburb. A woman answered the phone. Mike said that I gave her a description, told her the name and how long Linda had been missing, and she said, "Oh no, this girl is a little older and probably a little taller. Oh no, that's not your sister," and that was the last of it. Years would go by with no news about Linda, and both cases would grow cold. Weeks turned to months, months turned to years. Years turned to decades. The Strongsville Jane Doe's remains went unclaimed and were later interred at Pottersfield at Memorial Gardens in Highland Hills. Then in 2015, 22-year-old amateur sleuth and genealogy researcher Christina Skates was looking at the Highland Park cemetery records for one of her ancestors. She noticed a grave from 1975 that had no name. It simply said unknown white female bones. Skates felt compelled to search for the identity of this young woman. She began to search at her local library and found the newspaper clipping about the murder of the Strongsville Jane Doe. She called as many local detectives as she could until one finally sent her the digital cold case file. Skates then decided to go to Reddit. She posted all her findings and case information on a subreddit called Our Unresolved Mysteries under the username Call Me Ice from there. The case made its way to Web Sleuths, where a user who worked as a forensic artist, Carl Koppelman, was able to recreate a digital version of the woman's face from crime scene photographs. Koppelman's unique skills in facial recreation have earned him respect in the criminal investigation community. The young woman was never listed in any public databases, like NamUs or the Doe Network. For unknown reasons, Skates then contacted the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office about the case. Days later, the case was entered into NameUS, a federal database for missing and unidentified persons. In December of 2016, as soon as the case was entered into NamUs, the Akron police and its cold case detectives quickly made a potential link. They attempted to use dental records to identify the Strongsville Jane Doe with Linda Piano, but were unsuccessful. Authorities then exhumed the skeletal remains in October of 2017 with the assistance of the University of Akron, which provided magnetic and electronic surveying equipment to help map out the unmarked graves. Bone samples from the exhumed remains, in addition to DNA samples from Mike and Cheryl Pagano, were sent for DNA testing on June 29, 2018. The DNA revealed that the remains belonged to Linda Pagano. Police are now trying to determine who killed Linda Pagano, the only person to be named. A person of interest in Linda Pagano's disappearance was Brian Claflin, but he died in 1990, and no suspects have been publicly identified since. Grateful, though. On June 26, 1995, 21-year-old student Michael Eric Hager, who was traveling from Fairfax, Virginia to his mother's home in Inman, South Carolina, picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker with shaggy, blonde hair in his Volkswagen van in Virginia. At some point during the drive, Michael fell asleep at the wheel. At 1:30 p.m., Michael's van veered off and crashed into a pair of trees on U.S. Route 58 West in Greensville County, Virginia. Both of them suffered head injuries and died. Immediately, Michael was identified. But the unknown hitchhiker carried no ID, which made it impossible to identify him. It has been suggested that Michael may have agreed to transport the hitchhiker because of their similar styles of dress, as they both appeared to be fans of the Grateful Dead. Amongst the hitchhiker's belongings, he had a lighter, a few coins, and 2 scalp ticket stubs to a Grateful Dead concert. The concert took place at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. One ticket was for June 24, 1994, and another for June 25, 1995. A note was also found near his body which read, "Jason, sorry we had to go see you around. Call me Carolyn T and Carolyn O." The note had a phone number with a 914 prefix, but no area code. The number turned out to be a dead end for the police. Since he had no identification, the hitchhiker was deemed Grateful Doe. Fingerprint analysis was also unsuccessful due to the severity of lacerations on the hitchhiker's face. More jury photographs could not be released to the public, although a facial reconstruction was later released. In 2012, another facial reconstruction was created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Days turned to months and months turned to years, and eventually the case grew cold. Then 20 years later, across the world in Queensland, Australia, Redditor Layla Bett started getting into unsolved mysteries. She stumbled across the Grateful Joe case, where 2 men were killed in a car crash. One man was identified, but the other wasn't immediately. Bett, otherwise known as Reddit user Zombie Gray, was drawn to his story in January 2, 2015. Under the username Gray Metal, Layla published a post to Imager titled, "Do you recognize me? I have been without my name for nearly 20 years, in hopes of finding any information about the young man." She also created the Reddit community, Our Grateful Doe, in order to keep track of any possible leads. In the case, thousands of people joined in, and she spent several hours a day moderating the community, replying to comments, contacting law enforcement, and posting updates. Soon she got a message in her Reddit inbox from a guy named Steve. Steve said he recognized the guy in the composite sketches. He thought it looked like one of his old roommates from Illinois, a man named Jason. He only knew him by his first name. The man described Jason as a young free hippie surfer. At the time, Jason was working at the local McDonald's and discussed subjects like atheism and hallucinogens. And much like the deceased hitchhiker, Jason was a major deadhead. The roommate had also said he hadn't seen Jason since 1995. The man supplied photographs of his former roommate, who bore a striking resemblance to that of the reconstructions of the Grateful Doe. Not too long after, the story reached the mainstream media, and a lady named Margarita Evans came forward, stating that the young man in the photos was her son, Jason Callahan, who had been missing for 20 years. On January 12, 2015, Evans finally filed a missing persons report regarding the 1995 disappearance of her son, Jason Callahan. When asked why she hadn't reported him missing in 1995, Callahan's mother said she didn't know which jurisdiction to file the report with, due to the nomadic nature of Grateful Dead fans. Due to his nomadic nature, Callahan's family had presumed he'd gone to live on his own elsewhere. In January of 2015, law enforcement conducted a DNA test to see if Grateful Doe was the same man as Jason Callahan. DNA testing confirmed that the body was indeed that of Jason Callahan. The case was finally solved after 20 years. The Grateful Doe subreddit still exists, Now that its namesake case has been solved, the community features other missing persons cases, several of which have also been solved.